It was a nice summer day. My 5-year-old son James was playing in the backyard of our country house. James had always been a quiet boy, mostly playing alone. He never had many friends, but he always had a vigorous imagination. I was feeding our dog Fido in the kitchen when I heard something like James talking to someone in the backyard. I'm not sure who he might have been talking to. Could he have finally found a friend? Being a single mom, it's hard for me to always keep an eye on my son, so I decided to go outside and check on him. When I walked out into the backyard, I was a little confused because James was the only person there. Was he talking to himself? I could have sworn I heard a different voice. "James, it's time to go inside," I called out to him. He went inside and sat down at the kitchen table. It was already lunchtime, so I decided to make him a turkey sandwich. "James, who were you talking to in there?" I asked. James looked up for a moment.
"I was playing with my new friend,"
he said, smiling. I poured him some milk and continued to question him, as any good mother would do. "Does your friend have a name? Why didn't you invite him to have lunch with us?" I asked. James looked at me for a while before answering.
"His name is Laughing Jack."
I was a little stunned by what he said. "Oh, that's a weird name. What does your friend look like?" I asked, a little embarrassed.
"He's a clown. He has red hair, white face. He has a puffy dress, and he's always smiling."
I realized my son was talking about an imaginary friend. I guess it's normal for kids his age to have imaginary friends, especially when he doesn't have real kids to play with. It's probably just. The rest of the day went as usual. It was late and I put James to bed. I tucked him in, gave him a kiss and made sure to turn on the night light before I closed the door. I was very tired myself, so I decided to go to bed soon. I had a horrible nightmare. It was dark. I was in some rundown amusement park. I was scared to run through a vast field of empty tents, broken rides, and abandoned hunting lodges. The whole place looked terrible. Everything was black and white. Prize stuffed toys hung on hinges in the hunting huts. Everyone had sick grins plastered on their faces. I felt like the whole park was looking at me, even though there was no other living thing in sight. Suddenly, I began to hear music. The sounds of the song "Pop Goes the Weasel" playing on the jukebox echoed through the park. It was hypnotizing. I followed its tune to the circus tent almost in a trance, unable to stop my feet from moving forward. It was completely dark, the only light coming from a single spotlight shining in the center of the big top. Suddenly, a light came on. The brightness of the light was almost blinding. All I could see was a small, dark silhouette coming toward me. Then another one appeared, and another, and another. There were dozens of them, and they were all coming towards me. I couldn't move, my feet were freezing. All I could do was watch as the ghostly figures drew closer. As they got closer, I saw they were children. As I examined each of them, I noticed that they were all horribly disfigured. Some had cuts all over their bodies, some had severe burns, some were missing limbs and even eyes. The children surrounded me, clawed at my flesh, threw me to the ground, and tore me apart from the inside out. As the children tore me apart and I disappeared, all I could hear was laughter. Horrible, 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 evil laughter. The next morning I woke up in a cold sweat. Taking a few deep breaths, I looked over and saw several James figures facing me on my nightstand. I sighed. James must have woken up early and put these here. I gathered up my toys and headed to James' room. However, when I opened the door, James was sound asleep. I just shrugged, put the toys back in his toy box, and headed into the living room. A little while later, James woke up and I made him breakfast. He was quiet and seemed a little lethargic. Maybe he hadn't slept well either. I decided to ask him about the toys. "James, honey, did you put the toys in Mommy's room this morning?" His eyes stared at me for a moment and then quickly shifted to the cereal.
"Laughing Jack did."
I rolled my eyes and replied, "Well, Tell Laughing Jack to leave the toys in his room." James nodded and finished his breakfast and then decided to go play in the backyard. I went to rest in the living room and must have dozed off because I woke up a couple hours later. Shit. I need to check on James. I was a little worried. It's been over 2 hours and I still haven't checked on him. I went out to the backyard, but James was no longer there. I started to get nervous and yelled out to him, "James. James, where are you?" Exclamation mark. At that moment I heard laughter coming from the front yard. I rushed through the gate to the front of the house. James was sitting on the sidewalk. I breathed a sigh of relief and walked over to him. "James, how many times have I told you to stay in the backyard?" "James, what are you eating?" James looked at me, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a palm full of lollipops of all colors. This made me very nervous. "James, who gave you this candy?" James just looked at me and was silent. "James! Exclamation mark, please tell your mom where you got that candy." James lowered his head and said,
"Laughing Jack gave it to me."
My heart dropped and I knelt down to look him in the eye. "James, I've had enough of that damn Laughing Jack." He did not. "This is a very serious situation right now and I need to know who gave you the candy."
I saw my son's eyes fill with tears, but Mom, Laughing Jack actually gave me candy.
I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. James has never lied to me, but what he's telling me is impossible. I make him spit out the candy and throw the rest away. There seems to be nothing wrong with James. Maybe I'm just overreacting, because he could have gotten it from Tom and Linda next door or from Mr. Walker who lives down the street. Either way, I'll have to keep an eye on James. That night I put James to bed as usual and decided to go to bed early myself. Suddenly I was awakened by a loud pop from the kitchen. I jumped out of bed and hurried down the stairs. When I reached the kitchen, I was horrified. Everything on the shelves had been thrown to the floor and our dog Fido was hanging dead from the light fixture. His stomach was cut open and full of candy, the same kind James had eaten earlier that day. My shock was quickly overcome by a sharp scream coming from James' room, followed by loud rumbling noises. I quickly grabbed a knife from a drawer and moved up the stairs with the speed that only a mother whose child was in danger could have. I burst through the door and turned on the light. Everything in the room was overturned and strewn across the floor. My poor son was crying and shivering in his bed, a puddle of urine staining the sheets. I picked up my baby, ran out of the house and headed toward Tom and Linda's house. Luckily, they were still awake. They let me use their cell phone and I called the police. It didn't take them long and I explained what had happened. They looked at me like I was crazy. They searched the house but all they found was a dead dog and 2 trashed rooms. The officer told me that someone had probably broken into the house and had done so right before making a quick getaway when he heard me coming up the stairs. I knew that wasn't true. All the doors were locked and no windows were open. Anything in my house didn't come from outside. The next day James stayed home. I didn't want him out of my sight. I went to the garage and found his old baby monitor and set it up in his room. If anything happened tonight I would be able to hear it. I went to the kitchen and took the biggest knife from the drawer and put it on the nightstand. Imaginary friend or not, I'm not going to let anything hurt my little boy. Soon night fell. I put James to bed. He was scared, but I promised him I wouldn't let anything happen to him. I tucked him in, kissed him and turned on the nightlight. Before I closed the door I whispered to him, "Good night James, I love you." I tried to stay awake as long as possible, but after a few hours I felt myself falling asleep. My baby would be safe at night and I needed to sleep. As I laid my head on my pillow, I heard a soft noise from the baby monitor I had placed on my nightstand. At first it sounded like static, like the kind of static that a radio makes. Then it turned into a low moan. Was James asleep? Then I heard the laughter from my nightmare, that awful laugh. I jumped out of bed and grabbed a knife from under my pillow. I rushed to James' room and with a creak I opened the door. I tried to turn on the light, but it wouldn't turn on. I took a step and felt a warm thick liquid on my feet. Suddenly James's nightlight came on and I saw absolute terror in front of me. James' body was nailed to the wall, Nails pierced through his arms and legs. His chest had been cut wide open and his organs were hanging to the floor. His eyes and tongue had been removed along with most of his teeth. I was disgusted. I could hardly believe it was my boy. Then I heard the low, desperate moan again. James was still alive. My baby, my poor baby, in so much pain, barely clinging to life. I ran across the room and threw up on the floor. But my malaise was interrupted by a horrible clucking sound coming from behind me. I turned around, still wiping bile from my mouth, and then the villain responsible for all this horror, Laughing Jack, appeared out of the shadows. His ghostly white skin and tangled red hair hung down to his shoulders. He had piercing white eyes surrounded by dark black rings. His crooked smile exposed a row of sharp jagged teeth, and his skin didn't look like skin at all. It almost looked like rubber or plastic. He was wearing a white suit. He let out a sickening laugh, as if to let me know he was pleased with my reaction to his work. He then slowly turned around in front of James and started laughing even harder at the horrifying sight he presented. It was enough to shake me with horror. I bellowed, "Get away from him, you bastard!" I lunged at the monster, raising the knife above my head and stabbed him. But as soon as the knife touched him, he disappeared in a cloud of black smoke. The knife went through and pierced James' still beating heart, splattering warm blood in my face. No. What have I done? My baby, I killed my baby. I immediately fell to my knees and heard the sirens in the distance getting louder and louder. My boy, my sweet baby. I promised that mommy would protect you. But I failed. I'm sorry, James. I'm so sorry. The police soon arrived and found me in front of my son, still holding the knife drenched in my child's blood. The trial was short. I was placed in the home for the mentally ill, where I have been for the past 4 months. It's not so bad here.